Rome's aqueducts are one of the most impressive feats of engineering in the ancient world. Stretching for over 640 kilometers, they brought fresh water into the city, supplying it to public fountains, private homes, and even the public baths. But with such an extensive network of aqueducts, why did ancient Romans rely on expensive stone hinges instead of simply burying the pipes underground? Or even better, why didn't they just build their aqueducts out of concrete like modern pipes? You see, the Romans actually did use concrete extensively in their buildings and roads. So why not put that technology to use and make the aqueducts more efficient? Well, because of lost technology. You see, the Romans didn't know about the existence of cement or how to make concrete like we do today. Instead, they used a type of concrete known as opus cementitium, which is weaker than our modern concrete and was only resistant to water pressure when it was wet. And so when the aqueducts were full of water, the concrete would become hard and rigid. But once the water drained from the pipes, the concrete would become soft and weak again. That's why ancient Romans built their aqueducts above ground. They knew that if they buried the pipes underground, the weight of the soil above would compress the concrete, making it too soft to hold back the water pressure. In fact, when the aqueducts were built, there were special rules about where they could be built. The ground had to be flat and level and free of any slopes or inclines, because even a slight incline could cause problems. If the ground started sloping downward, then the aqueduct couldn't effectively transport water up the slope. And if the ground sloped upwards, then the aqueduct couldn't fill up properly. As a result, this limited where the aqueducts could be built. For example, there was no aqueduct along the Palatine Hill because it was too hilly. But that's not all. Building aqueducts above ground also had its own set of advantages. For one thing, it made maintenance much easier. If a leak developed in the pipes, it would be much easier to repair the exposed section of aqueduct above ground rather than digging up the entire thing. It also made it easier to monitor the flow of water. Just by looking at the aqueduct, workers could tell whether the flow was steady and consistent. However, building aqueducts above ground did have its downsides, such as being vulnerable to vandalism and requiring regular upkeep. The aqueducts needed to be painted every few years to keep them watertight. And if that wasn't done, algae would start growing on the surface, which would eventually lead to leaks. The aqueducts were also prone to collapse, especially during earthquakes, and that would lead to floods in the streets of Rome. In fact, many aqueducts suffered damage during the reign of Nero, but these were quickly repaired. So the downsides weren't necessarily a huge concern. And it's not like the Romans hadn't considered the idea of putting their pipes underground. You see, they did bury some aqueducts, but only under rivers or small valleys. Otherwise, they preferred to elevate the pipes above the ground. They knew that burying the pipes would save some money, but they also knew that it would cost them more in maintenance. As far as the lost technology behind Rome's aqueducts, it comes down to two major factors. First of all, Romans didn't have the right ingredients to make concrete like we do today. For example, they didn't have Portland cement, which is the main ingredient in modern concrete. Instead, they used a mixture of crushed brick, pottery, pulverized marble, and volcanic ash called pozzolana. This type of concrete was weaker than ours, so it needed to be reinforced with stone hinges and arches to keep it from collapsing. Speaking of stone hinges, those were another lost technology. You see, the Romans had figured out how to make arches and vaults, which are basically curved stone hinges. These allowed them to build large structures without the need for supports. But they didn't know how to make small stone hinges like we use in modern plumbing. In fact, the smallest stone hinge they ever made was about the size of a doorway, which is why the aqueducts had to be elevated off the ground. Now, the reason why they didn't develop the technology for small stone hinges is because they didn't really need it. Their aqueducts were fairly simple and didn't require complex plumbing. They didn't even have shut-off valves. Instead, They used a series of gates to control the flow of water throughout the city. This worked out pretty well for them, although it wasted a lot of water. When the gates were closed, the water would just keep flowing through the aqueducts and end up being wasted. Today, on the other hand, we use pipes with smaller diameters and install shut-off valves so we can control exactly where the water goes. Another reason why the Romans didn't develop small stone hinges is because they didn't really need them for anything else. Their buildings and roads were made out of stone and concrete, which didn't require small hinges. For example, they used arches and vaults in their buildings, but they never used small stone hinges in the walls themselves. In fact, the only place they used small stone hinges was in the aqueducts. So it wasn't really worth their time to develop new technology just for this purpose. But while the Romans may not have invented concrete or plumbing, they did invent a bunch of other stuff, like the aqueduct itself. And it turns out the aqueduct was actually invented a few thousand years before the Roman Empire even existed. The earliest aqueducts were built in Greece around 700 BC, but they were nothing like the Roman aqueducts. The Greeks built theirs out of wood and stone, and they were only used to supply water to a single building, like a temple or a palace. The first empire to use aqueducts extensively was the Persian Empire. They built an extensive network of aqueducts throughout their territories, including the world's first pressurized water system. However, the Romans improved upon the aqueduct significantly. For one thing, they built much longer aqueducts. The longest aqueduct built by the Persians was only about 11 kilometers long, but the Romans built aqueducts that were over 90 kilometers long. And while the Persians used aqueducts to supply water to palaces and temples, the Romans used them to supply water to public fountains, public baths, and even private homes. They also built aqueducts to supply water to farms and vineyards outside the city. This helped to make Rome one of the most livable cities in the ancient world, and it was one of the main reasons why the empire lasted so long. So while the Romans didn't invent concrete or plumbing, they did invent many other technologies that helped to make their empire one of the greatest in history. Unfortunately, much of this technology has been lost over the centuries. But thankfully, we've managed to preserve some of it for future generations to enjoy. Speaking of ancient technology, you might be wondering what happened to all the inventions of the Soviet Union. Click here to watch our video on the top 5 forgotten inventions of the USSR. And thank you for watching.